Willkommen in einem anderen Afrikaans video, or welcome to another exciting video. In this case, part 1 of my PRESTAGS example game series of videos, which may actually only end up being one video, but I'm not quite sure at the present moment. PRESTAGS is a series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This video uses a figure gaming version of these rules. Because the rules are so simple, I decided not to create any videos describing how to play the board game, or the figure version of the board game. Instead, an example of play should allow anyone to quickly pick up the rules and play a game if they so desire. Now, PRESTAG means pre-17th century tactical game system. The game system took a number of earlier SPI games, Armageddon, Phalanx, Centurion, Dark Ages and Renaissance of Infantry, and standardized all the game systems so they used the same basic CRT rules, etc. This allowed players to pit an ancient Egyptian force against Gustav Adolphus, for example. This example game uses a scenario from the Spartan part of the game series, and the specific scenario is the marathon scenario. I've created a PDF file with all the scenarios. This shows the 2 printable pages which describes the marathon scenario. The map on the right is my template for players to create the playing area using my hexless version of these rules, which I'm currently working on. This example will be covering the original hexed version of the rules, using a standard figure gaming playing area with hexes superimposed upon it. This shows the playing area. In this case, it's a beta version of my hex playing area. I removed the roads from this playing area as it did not work with hexes, which you can actually see if you look closely enough. In this case, the hexes are 6 centimeters in size, and the playing area is 120 centimeters by 80 centimeters, or 4 feet wide by 2 2/3 feet deep. The hex grid is about 20 hexes wide by about 12 to 13 hexes deep, which is not very large for a board game sized game. A hex-based playing area is not very efficient in the way it uses a playing area. This is not an issue when the playing pieces are only 1 to 2 centimeters squares, but when the pieces are standard 4 centimeter wide elements, it requires a huge playing area. Many scenarios using this game system would require a 4 by 6 foot playing area, but in this case the marathon battle or scenario fits nicely onto a single playing area, as you see here. This shows the standard deployment according to the scenario in these rules. The rivers on either flank are impassable. The red line represents the Greek deployment area, with the star next to the water feature at the top, the Persian deployment area start point. Basically, the distance from the line to the water feature is 5 hexes. When we look at the scenario in more detail, you'll see the Persians need to minimize contact on game turn 1, as their missile troops have a reduced capacity during game turn 1. The Persians could deploy along the water feature, but then their ability to move forces around are greatly reduced. I don't know what the best tactic is, so I went for what I thought was a historical deployment. As it turned out, my historical deployment was not quite historical enough, and the modifications to it actually probably were not a good idea. If I followed an exact historical deployment, as seems logical from a figure gaming point of view, I think I would have done better, as we'll discuss at the end of the video. The first player to deploy is the Persian player. And what you see along the top of this screen is the Persian deployment that I selected. I'll go into more details why I selected this deployment. Then the Greek player deploys, which you'll see at the bottom. And I'll go through why I think the Greek player deployed in this manner, which I think actually is a pretty good deployment. This shows the Persian force mix and the deployment instructions. And now that I've created the video, I realize I made an error. The Persians must deploy within 3 hexes of the deployment hex, not including the deployment hex. This does limit the options of the Persian, but it really only had a minor influence on the game based on the way I deployed. I didn't know this or didn't take it note, and as you would have seen from the previous deployment, many of the units are well beyond 3 hexes. The Persians have 8 militia infantry and 8 bow infantry, which are Persian and median foot. They also have 4 Milesian spearmen, which are Ionian hoplites, 4 barbarian infantry, which probably are Thracian or similar type troops, and 8 skirmishers, which probably would be javelmen for the most part. The Persians can stack 2 units per hex. This shows the Greek deployment instructions and also their force mix. The Greeks have 22 militia spearmen, which are all hoplites. The Greeks can stack 3 units per hex. Both sides have 1 leader, which has a quality of 2. Starting with the Greeks, and what you see here are the Greek elements, formed 3 elements per hex. The Greek hoplites each have a melee strength of 3 and a movement allowance of 3. Now, I don't possess a Persian army, and it's certainly an army that I'm seriously considering to purchase and paint up, but at the present moment I don't. So as a result, I had to mix some of my Teutonic infantry and pretend they were Persian. So let's start with the main Persian or medium troops. Now, I decided to deploy what I thought was the historical deployment of the Persian forces, which had their shield-bearing militia infantry in the front rank and the bowmen behind. The militia infantry have a melee strength of 2 and a movement of 3. The bowmen have no melee capacity and a movement of 5. The bowmen do have a fire strength of 2 and a fire range of 2. According to this scenario, the Persians do have 4 units of militia spearmen or hoplites. These are the same as the Greek hoplites. In this case, I decided to use peltas to represent them so I wouldn't get them mixed up. Strangely enough, the barbarian infantry are the real shock forces of the Persian. They attack at 6 in melee, defend at 3 in melee, and have a movement allowance of 5. They're actually incredibly good units, which took me a while to work out. The final troop types are the skirmishers. These have a melee attack strength of 2, a defense of 1, and a fire strength of 2, and a range of 1 hex. I really mismanaged the skirmishers in this game, and I personally think the problem that I had was that I should have actually lined up the skirmishers with the spearmen in the front rank and had the bowmen in the hex behind. Anyway, something that I only realised halfway through the game. Now we come to the leaders. And each leader for both sides has a melee value of 0, a movement rate of 9, and a combat bonus of 6, with a control radius of 2 hexes. All friendly units within the control radius move normally. If those units are outside the control radius, their movement is halved, fractions rounded upwards. Going through the deployment, my thought processes were that the main Persian line in the centre should consist of what I thought was a historical foot in the front rank and bowmen in the rear. Now, as it turned out, in the game, this was not such a wise strategy. I probably should have actually mixed the skirmishers with the spearmen and had the bowmen in the hex to the rear. Because the bowmen have a range of 2 hexes, they can certainly still fire into the Greeks, and they add virtually nothing to the melee. Anyway, an error I made, and I suffered accordingly. I decided to place the hoplites on my right flank. Now, in retrospect, I made an error, and I could have not have deployed them here, as all Persians had to be within 3 hexes of the deployment hex, shown by the red splash symbol at the top in the centre. Nonetheless, I think placing the hoplites on one of the flank was the correct strategy. I should have just simply moved them into the location I wanted to move them on my first game turn. The barbarian infantry I placed on my left flank. Once again, this deployment is not correct because of the 3 hex limit, but ignoring this, I think it's the correct deployment as long as they weren't attacked on the first game turn, because of course they attack with 6, but when they defend they're at 3, so you want them to go in to attack initially. You just need to make sure they're protected on the first game turn, and that was something I achieved. My error here was that I had skirmishers in front of it, which really was not the correct place for my skirmishers. I totally stuffed up the use of my skirmishers. Because I really didn't know where to place the skirmishers, I placed them where you see them here. Now, I should have actually placed them with the spearmen in the centre and had the bowmen to the rear, as I've mentioned this before. But nonetheless, a classic example of I don't know what to do with the guys that run around with javelin. And actually this is really quite common even in normal figure gaming. They're quite a useful troop type, but you need to understand how to use them effectively. The Greek deployment is rather simple. Because of any unit outside of control range or radius of its leader would have a movement of 2, and the Persians were deployed well back, the Greeks could only have 15 units contact the Persian front line on game turn 1. The elements in the rear could have been placed further on the flank, but it would not have mattered because if they were, their movement would have been reduced to 2 instead of 3, and having them 1 hex to the rear really gave them the same, would have resulted in them ending up in the same position at the end of their movement phase, so it just doesn't matter. Now let's start the game. It's game turn 1 and the Greek player is the first player. As there are no chariots in this scenario, let's ignore the first player chariot phase. We'll move straight to the fire combat phase. Oh, well, the Greeks actually have no fire combat units, so this is skipped as well. Now we move to the movement phase, and the Greeks can move, and they certainly have to. The Greeks now move into contact. This shows the Greek position after its movement phase. There is a special rule on game turn 1. The Persian fire units do not have a zone of control and cannot conduct what's called defensive fire. Defensive fire is triggered by any enemy unit moving into its zone of control. This is why I deployed the Persians to the rear. But in retrospect, I now realise that was an error. I must point out I have never played this board game, or never really played this board game very much in the old days, as it was never really used in any of the board game competitions that I attended. And the board game version, quite frankly, does not really have a very good feel to it. The reason why I'm playing the original rules in this manner is so I can understand how to convert the rules into a hexless format. But as a result, it's been a bit of a struggle to remember the rules, that is to understand the rules and remember them in the game. And I did make 1 or 2 minor errors in this game that I would have never made if I played one of the more commonly played board games that I used in board game conventions. Now we move to the melee phase. The Greeks now attack. Now what I did was I identified 5 melee combats and spun the dice and just placed it next to the units accordingly. Unlike the other board games that I've converted into figure gaming formats, combat is not compulsory. You simply attack whatever you so desire. Now the combat order in this case is not that important, so let's start with the Greek left flank. The Greeks attack with 9, that is 3 hoplites, each with 3, against 2. The defender has a militia infantry, which has a melee value of 2, and the bowman has a melee value of nothing. The Greeks spin a 4, resulting in a half eliminated result. Because the bowmen by themselves are rather vulnerable, I took the bowmen as casualties and the remaining element became disrupted. For the next attack, we once again have 9, that's 3 hoplite elements, 3 each, against 2. That's 1 militia infantry with a value of 2 and a bowman a value of 0, and the Greeks spin a 5, resulting in once again a half eliminated result. The bowman is eliminated and the infantry is disrupted. For the third attack, the Greeks attack with 15 against 2. Now the Greeks add the leader value, so let's break it down. There are 3 elements, each with 3, that's equal 9. The leader has a combat bonus of 6. It can add that to the 9, giving it a total of 15. The defenders have the standard 2. A 1 is spun, resulting in a half eliminated result. The bowman is eliminated and the infantry is disrupted. Now we move over to the Greek right flanks. The Greek attacks with their standard 9 against 2. They spin a 3, which results in just a disrupted result. The Persians are disrupted, that is, both elements are disrupted. Now we come to the last combat. Once again, we have 9 against 2. A 2 is spun. The result is a D, which means the Persians, both elements, are disrupted. Now we move to what's called the mutual disruption recovery phase. Any disrupted units recover unless they were disrupted in the current phasing player turn, which means in this case no units recover, and all the Persian disrupted units remain disrupted during the Persian player turn. It is now the Persian player turn, and they start with the fire combat phase. Now in this case, the Persians can't move any units into a good fire position. They just simply fire with what they have in the positions that they currently have the units. So the Persian skirmishers start the fire combat, and they will be firing against the Greek hoplites. Now the attack strength here is 4. That is, each skirmish unit has a fire combat value of 2 and a range of 1. So they can reach it. That totals 4. Now the defensive strength of the target is not based on the elements in it. It's based on the hex, which in this case is 3. The odds are 1 to 1. The bowmen to the left are disrupted, so they cannot assist. You couldn't actually fire as much missile fire as you possibly can get to bear on a single hex. But in this case, this is the only missile units that the Persians have on this particular flank. The Persians spin a fire, which means that the Greeks are disrupted. Ooh, a great victory for the Persian forces. Now in the centre, the Persians concentrate their available bowmen against the single hoplite element. They would have preferred to focus on a larger stack because of course any result applies to everything in the hex, but that would require it to split the attack, and the result would end up being 2 1-to-2 attacks, and I don't think that's a good strategy. Anyway, they combine both bowmen, which have a fire strength of 2 each, against the single hoplite, which has a defense of 3. The odds are 1 to 1. They spin a 5, and the result is a disruption. Now, if I decided to use the bowman, one bowman against one Greek stack each, it would have been a 1 to 2, and a 5 would have resulted in a nothing. So that's why it's important to concentrate your bow fire if you want to get a result. That's the end of the fire phase. This shows the position on the Persian left flank. As you can see, there are a lot of Persian units disrupted. You can see 3 hexes disrupted, but the Persians have managed to disrupt 2 hexes worth of Greek units as well. Oops, I forgot. There was one more missile fire or fire combat on the Persian right flank. In this case, we have one bowman, which has a value of 2, against 3, which means the odds are 1 to 2. They spin a 5, which means there's no result. The skirmishers to the left of the bowmen only have a range of 1, so they can't reach anyone. Now we move to the second player movement phase, and the Persians can now move any units which are not disrupted or not in contact with enemy units. This shows the position at the end of the Persian movement phase. Because of the deployment issues, the outflanking should not really be occurring, but as it turned out, it failed to achieve its objective. Because of the grain of the hexes, I'm not using the optional flank rule. If I did this, then possibly this would be more serious. But as indicated, it's not possible if I followed the correct deployment phase. Now, I'll be talking about the flank rules later in this video and why I didn't use them. I don't think the flank rules as stipulated in the SPI board game works particularly well with hexes. There are ways for it to work if they did it in a slightly different way, but not the way that they've stipulated the rules. However, saying all that, in a hexless version, flank attacks or some bonus for flank attacks I think are essential. Now we move to the second player melee combat phase. The Persians now conduct melee. Starting with the Persian left flank, they attack with 28 against 9. Now, to just break down where the 28 comes from, each of the barbarian infantry attack with 6, so there are 4 6s, 24. Each of the skirmishers that you see at the bottom attack at 1, even though they defend at 2. There are 4. When you add the 2 together, you get 28. The defenders have 3 3s, which is 9, which means the combat is 3 to 1. The Persians spin a 3, which results in a disruption. A second disruption results in elimination, a mighty victory for the forces of Persia. The skirmishers, or at least two of the skirmishers, advance after combat. On the other flank, that is the Persian right flank, the Persians attack with 16 against 9. Let's break down where these numbers come from. First of all, there are 4 hoplite units. Each hoplite has an attack of 3, so 4 by 3 is 12 points. There are 2 skirmishers. They attack with 1 each, so that's 2 points as well. And then finally, we have the militia infantry, which attack at a value of 1. So we add it all together, we get to 16 against 9, which is a 1-to-1 attack. 5 is spun, resulting in a disruption. The mighty Persians continue to show the Greeks who is boss, and weirdly enough, the successes on the flanks are not being reproduced historically here for some reason. This shows the position at the end of the Persian melee phase. The Greeks have lost 3 elements and 4 are disrupted, which is not good for the Greeks. Now, as you can see here, historically the Greeks did quite well on the flanks and didn't do so well in the centre. What we're seeing here, that the Persians are doing probably better than they did historically on the flanks, which tells me I've put too many forces on the flanks and not enough in the centre, which is almost certainly exactly what has occurred here. Now we have both players conduct mutual disruption recovery. Now this only affects the Persian forces because all the Greek disruptions occurred in the current player phase, so they can't be undisrupted. But the Persian disruptions occurred in the previous player phase, so they are recovered. Once we've removed all the disruption markers, this shows the position at the end of game turn 1. It actually doesn't look very good for the Greeks here. At least I thought personally that I had this game in the bag. Little did I realise. We now move into game turn 2. The restriction on the Persian fire troops or missile troops is now removed. They can conduct missile fire as normal. The Greeks the Greeks don't have any chariots, they don't have any missile troops, so now they go into the movement phase, they move. Now just to show you what missile defensive fire can do, the Greeks have moved into a Persian zone of control. So as a result, those Persian bowmen can conduct defensive fire. Now they may choose not to and then simply conduct defensive fire during their missile phase, but if the Greeks manage to disrupt any of these 2 stacks, then that's not possible. So as the Persian player, I've decided to use defensive fire. So the first defensive fire throw is 4, that is 2 bowmen, which can fire at the Greek hoplite. Now, even though the bowmen have a range of 2, and there are other bowmen within range, a defensive fire can only be conducted against enemy units which have entered a zone of control, which is adjacent to them. So, the combat is 4 versus 3, a 5 is spun and the result is a disruption. The defensive fire has been very effective. For the next defensive fire, the Greeks have moved these 2 elements into a zone of control and the Persians decide to use defensive fire against them. In this case it's 2 versus 3, which is an odd of 1 to 2. They spin a 2, which means there's no result. It's now the Greek melee phase. The Greeks attack with 3 against 1 and spin a 5. The result is half a limb. One skirmisher is eliminated and the other is disrupted. I actually, now, in retrospect, I made an error here. I assume the skirmishers have the same melee defense strength as bowmen, which is not the case. Now for the next attack, it's 6 versus 1 and a 6 is spun. The result is eliminate. Once again, when I created this video, I realised I made an error here and I assumed while I played the game, the skirmishers had the same melee strength as bowmen. Bowmen have a melee strength of 0. If they're by themselves, they have a value of 1. If they're stacked with anything else, they have a value of 0. When 2 bowmen are together, basically the melee value is 1. I assume the skirmishers were the same as that, which is not the case. The skirmishers have a defensive melee strength of 1. The Greek player decides to advance one of the hoplite elements into this hex. As we move along the line, the next melee, the Greeks attack with 3 against 2, spin a 6. The result is disruption. In the next attack, the Greeks attack with 6 against 2 and spin a 5. The result is half a limb. The Persian unit is eliminated because the half a limb is fractions rounded up, not fractions rounded down. So as there's only one element, half of that is half, rounded up is 1, it's eliminated. Now for a really big Greek attack. The Greeks attack with 15, remember that's 9 for the hoplites and 6 for the leader. Against 2 and spin a 4, the result is eliminated. The Greek advances 1 element into the vacated hex. Another reasonably large attack, the Greek attack with 9 against 2 and spin a 6. The result is once again eliminated. Very good result for the Greeks and not so good for the Persians. The Greek advances after combat with 2 elements into the vacated hex. The situation is really not looking very good for my mighty Persian forces. This shows positions at the end of the Greek melee phase. During the disruption removal phase, the Greek disruption markers are removed except for the one which occurred during the current player phase. It's now the Persian player turn. They start with missile fire. Only one unit can fire because the other unit conducted defensive fire in the last player phase. One issue with this game system is you really do need markers to indicate what things have done in the previous player turn. It's unavoidable. I don't particularly like it, but it is what it is. Okay, it's 2 versus 3, which is 1 to 2, and I spin a 1. No effect. Here is another 1 to 2 missile fire attack, and a 1 is spun, which means once again no effect. We get the Persian skirmishers conducting fire combat. In this case, it's a fairly large attack, 4 against 3, which means the odds is 1 to 1. I spin a 1, no effect. Damn it. All the fire combats have been completed. It's now the Persian movement phase, and this is the status after the Persian move. Continuing with my flank attacks, in this case starting with the Persian left flank, I attack with 24. That's 6 for each of the barbarian infantry. 4 of makes 24 against 3, and spin a 3. The result is eliminated. The single hoplite unit is eliminated and destroyed. Another mighty victory. The Persians do not advance after combat in this particular case. Now we go to a lesser attack. In this case, it's the main Persian line. The Persians attack with 4 against 6, which means the odds is 1 to 2. They spin a 5, which means there is no effect. Now we get my leader finally getting involved in the combat. This is one error I made. I should have almost certainly placed the leader with the barbarian infantry, or possibly with my hoplites, but anyway, it is what it is. The Persians attack with 4. Now the reason why it's 4 is that the the militia infantry have an attack strength of 2. Even though my leader has a combat bonus of 6, it can only give it 2. It can only match the actual melee strength of the actual elements attacking. So anyway, it's 4 against 3, it's 1 to 1, I spin a 4, the result is disruption, at least another minor victory. Now we come to the other Persian major attack on the Persian right flank. It is 14 against 9, and they spin a 1, no effect. This is a very bad result. During the disruption removal phase, the Persian removes their disruption markers, and of course the Greek disruption marker from the previous player turn is also removed, and we now move to game turn 3. During the Greek player turn, they have no fire units, so they skip the fire phase. They then move and start their melee phase. In the first melee, they attack with 6 against 2 and spin a 6, half a limb. Another very good result. The bowman is removed and the remaining element is disrupted. Incidentally, the reason why there is no defensive fire is this unit did not move into the fire unit's zone of control in this particular player turn. It was already there, so as a result you don't get defensive fire. In the next grid attack, it's a 9 against 2, and a 2 is spun. It's a disruption. Another major Greek attack, in this case 9 versus 2, a 2 is spun again, resulting in disruption. This is about the best luck I could possibly expect. So, what comes around goes around. But regardless of this good luck here, that is 2 2s spun by the Greeks, the situation's not looking very good for me. Now we get another Greek attack. In this case it's 6 against 4. Remember, the defenders have a melee defense of 2, I get 2 from the leader, but only 2. It's a 1-to-1. The Greeks spin a 2, and there is no effect. The reason why the defender only got 2 is, as I've indicated before, the leader bonus can never exceed the combat strength of the attack or defence of the actual element. This is really to stop putting a leader with a skirmish unit and then ending up with a mighty melee missile unit, which if mounted is also very mobile. On the Greek left flank, the Greeks attack with 9 against 2 and spin a 6. Unfortunately, my good luck did not hold out and my skirmishers are eliminated. Now the Greeks are attacking with 18 against 6, and a 6 is spun. The result is half eliminated. One of my Ionian elements is eliminated, that's the hoplites, and the other is disrupted. Again, another very bad luck die roll. Incidentally, the reason why the Greeks attack with 18 is that there are 4 elements, which is 12, and they get the 6 for the leader. Now the Greeks have 1 element left over, and they use it to attack the Persian units. In this case, it's 3 versus 2, 1-to-1, and a 3 is spun, no effect. I wasn't to realise it at this point, but the last hoplite that was eliminated was a turning point in the battle, as we discovered at the end of the game, and we'll discuss concerning the panic rules, or in reference to the panic rules. Now, PRESTAGS is a very simple game with a number of optional rules. I use most of the optional rules with some exceptions, and one of the optional rules is the panic rule. Once the Persian forces have suffered 31 points of losses, the army panics. And when I did the calculation here, I discovered that I was going to get some very bad news. Incidentally, concerning the panic rules, it's supposed to, an army's supposed to panic the moment this occurs. The trouble is, unless you're sitting down and counting out the points after every single event on the playing area, it's difficult for that to occur. I normally check panic at the end of the game turn. As it turned out, it did occur at the correct time because it was the last Ionian hoplite unit which pushed me over the limit. And let's look at the details of how this occurred. This is all the eliminated units. At the top you see 4 hoplite units which were eliminated. That's what I eliminated. And all the elements to the bottom of it are the Persian units eliminated. Now each skirmish and bow unit is worth 3 points. This totals 27 points so far. Now the militia infantry is 1 point each, which brings the total up to 30. The militia spearmen is worth 2 points, which brings it up to 32. My panic level is 31. My army now panics. This shows the final position after the panic is applied. All units with a red hit marker is panicking. Basically, I only have 2 units and a leader which is not panicking or not disrupted. The game is effectively over. The Greeks need to eliminate 17 Persian units to win. They've eliminated 13 so far, so they only need to eliminate a further 4 elements in the following 9 game turns. We did not play the game any further, but I feel 2 game turns would be all that's required in order to achieve this, which means the whole game, in this case, lasted for no more than 90 minutes. Well, where did I go wrong? In retrospect, I feel a better and more scenario-accurate Persian deployment is what you can see here, and this is the reason where I went wrong. What I should have had was the front rank consisting of the skirmish element in conjunction with the militia infantry. This gives each hex a defence strength of 3, and any unaffected skirmishers will be in range to conduct fire combat during their phasing fire combat phase. Behind the front rank is a solid bowman line which can provide significant fire attack capability against the Greek front line. These elements are not correctly faced, but if faced correctly, up to 6 bowmen could hit a single Greek hex, which is 12 versus 3 or 3-1. This could be devastating and would encourage the Greeks to keep the centre of its line as thin as possible while focusing on its flank. By keeping the centre thin, it means if the Persians get a lucky die roll at 3-1, it doesn't affect so many elements. In the rear, I would deploy my main counterattack forces, barbarian infantry and Ionian hoplites. As for the Greek tactics, focusing on the flanks while keeping the centre thin would probably be wise, but I would need to probably think about this in more detail and probably do a few more test games. I have mainly focused on the Persian tactics in this particular video. Well, let's look at a summary. In summary, the game system works very well. I originally thought it was going to be so simplistic as to be rather boring, but there is sufficient nuance in the game system to make the game rather interesting. The game system is very playable and gives me a reasonable result, which roughly, I suppose, could be considered as historical. The scenario itself is surprisingly balanced once the Persian player knows what to do, and the Persian player is definitely the more difficult player to play. Historically, the actual scenario is probably incorrect, as most historians feel the battlefield was in a totally different place, as depicted in this particular scenario, and the Persians had a lot more room to the rear. But, the joys of ancient conflict is the lack of knowledgeable references allows any guess to be plausible, and you know what? This guess could be as plausible as any of the other guesses which have been made by historians or non-historians. Where would these rules fit? Well, look, these rules really do fit into the DBA segment of the hobby, 1 to 2 hour games, except instead of being points-based, the games are historical battle-based. Some work needs to be done to the scenario to allow play on a smaller playing area, or some of the scenarios, etc. I like the marathon scenario because it starts in a very traditional figure gaming manner. Both sides line up, ready for contact, and then they just go in there. Also, it doesn't require a very large playing area. Many scenarios in this set of rules start with the opposing forces much further away and players being forced to deal with operational issues not commonly considered in a traditional figure game. This is actually really good. It's one of the big strengths of the SPI PRESTAG, but requires a very large playing area if you're using hexes. Once again, this is not a deal breaker, but having a 4x6 foot playing area for a 2 hour game where the conflict only takes up a small part of the playing area may seem a little bit odd to some players, but it does work, and it works reasonably well. I will need to test this out when I go to the club and play a scenario which actually requires a much larger playing area to see what the feel and look of it is. Now I just want to do a quick overview of the actual rules, and specifically the optional rules. The basic rules are really very basic, but there are a large number of optional rules which players can use. I use the panic optional rules, as battling out chess-like until only one element is left is not really very reasonable or much fun. The other optional rule I use is the contact optional rule. In the original game system, you can freely leave hexes adjacent to enemy units or even move across the enemy front line if they lack missile-armed troops. The contact rule means if opposing elements are involved in a melee and are not subject to a disrupted, half a limb or eliminated result, they are considered to be in contact with the enemy and cannot move. My only issue with this is you need to deploy counters to indicate this, and I dislike any form of counters on the playing area, but nonetheless I think it's far more reasonable to have opposing elements locked in melee rather than allowing a unit to go into melee, battle it out, discovering they're not going to get anywhere, and then just simply move out willy-nilly, or even move across the playing area if there's no missile troops. Another rule which I use is the retreat before combat rule. In this case, units which are faster can retreat one hex instead of being attacked in the non-phasing combat phase. I did not use this rule in this game because there's no room to retreat for the Persian, but I feel this rule is sufficiently simple and realistic to be worthwhile including. I would suspect this is especially important if you're going to have, let's say, Mongol hordes or Hunnic hordes floating around, or even Scythian horsemen, because I don't think those guys would like to stick it around in a melee if they're caught, and I think they would be fast enough to get away from particularly foot-type troops. Another rule which I use is what's called the melee combat and elevation rule. Now, I have no idea why this rule is even an optional rule. I would have thought this would have been better to be a standard rule, but then I suppose a lot of battles don't involve hills. Basically, it provides an elevation effect for melee fighting. Fighting up a hill is bad, fighting down a hill is good, for example. Now, one rule which I always wanted to include, but then had to change my mind after testing it out, was the facing rule. Facing in the ancient period is important, and fire units can only fire out if it's forward 3 hexes in the standard game, but when the elements are correctly deployed, it can look rather odd on a hex grid, as you can see here. This is one issue with hexes. This is only an aesthetic issue, but there are more tangible issues with facing and hexes. The rules allow elements to adopt different facings in a hex. Now, this is not an issue with board games, but can be when using figures, as you can see here. None of these issues are insurmountable, but they are fiddly and annoying. Worrying about the facing of every element after every single movement phase can really add to the time required to play a game. And it's not adding time in a good way, that is, in a fun way. It's adding time in a really laborious, painful way. Personally, I feel a simpler rule is if a unit is attacked from 4 or more hex sides, then it's assumed to be attacked in the flank. It doesn't matter about the facing. You shouldn't worry about the way elements are faced, except for fire combat. But for melee combat, basically, if there are 4 units attacking from 4 different directions, you can't avoid being hit in the flank. Now, I may consider this modification if I ever do a modified version of this game, particularly on a hex. But for now, the game remains unchanged, and I do not use the flank rule. Incidentally, there is a standard flank rule, which is a surrounded rule. That is, if an element has all 6 hexes with enemy units in them and it's attacked, it's considered to be surrounded, which has the same effect as a flank attack. But this is a pretty extraordinary circumstance, so it doesn't replace the requirement for flank, factors to be included in the game. Now, while I believe the standard game works well, I do intend on creating a hexless version of it, as well as a version which uses WRG troop types and the WRG army list. While I do enjoy DBM and DBMM, they're simply too complex for new players to quickly absorb, and something simpler as an introductory experience is needed. The other aspect is duplicating historical battles. Most figure gaming rules do not focus on this, and I feel that's another gap in the hobby which needs filling. PRESTAG is really designed to reproduce historical battles, and if that's what you want to do, then this is the rules that you want to go. These are the rules that you probably go for. As a points-based experience, PRESTAG is probably not such a good set of rules. So, part 1 of my PRESTAGs example games video comes to a close. I may do another example game, this time a larger battle such as Kane or Zama. Good test for any game system is the Battle of Kane, and that'll tell me if this game system can really fly for extreme examples in terms of historical battles. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.